there, Banditos! It's that time of week again where we fling open the doors of your local comic book shop and talk to your favorite comic book creators of yesterday and today. And we hope that you enjoyed our live stream last week. But as always, we don't let the dust settle. We're coming at you with a brand new episode. But before we get to that, let's get the intros out of the way. I am Joe Marcello.
I am Mike Farah.
And as always, we're bringing you a comic book greatness. But before we do that, let's give you something else. A big thank you to our sponsor, Tomorrow's Publishing. Remember to check out their fine publications at tomorrows.com. That's TWOMORROWS.com. We are thrilled to have them as our sponsor and to be working with them. So now on with the show. So today we're bringing you our interview with another comic book heavy hitter. I mean, he's done some great work in comics, but beyond comics, unfortunately, we didn't even get a chance to scratch the surface of that. So what can I say that hasn't already been said? I mean, he's worked on Superman Earth 1. Absolutely fantastic. I love that series. 3 volumes of that, which was really great. And then other versions of other characters as well. So much fun, that series. Not to mention, all his television credits. They're fantastic.
Yeah, he is a heavy hitter, just like Joe said. I was shocked, actually, when I received the response that he would be willing to go on air with us. Very excited. He's one of my favorite writers, and he works in so many different genres and so many different formats. I mean, he came from animation. He does a lot of live action. I'm sorry, Babylon 5 guys. We don't get into the series on this one. We are a comic book and sometimes animation podcast, but we do get into a lot of the comics. Superman, as Joe mentioned, Rising Stars and Midnight Suns, those big 2 series that kind of launched his career at Image Comics. Amazing Spider-Man, the huge run there, Thor. So really the biggest of icons in the comics world, and couldn't be a nicer guy. So let's get to it. This is J. Michael Straczynski.
I just want to tell you off the bat that we are just absolutely honored and privileged to have you on our show today. You've worked on so many.
Last.
No, all right. Well, all right. Good night, everybody. No, you've worked on so many great things that we are fans of. However, we ask everyone the same question to start it off. How did you discover comic books?
I was maybe 9 or 10, maybe 8 or 9. No, not 9 or 10. And my family and I used to move around a great deal. My first 17 years, we moved 21 times because my father had a unique economic philosophy. Blown the town, went up a lot of bills and split. So we were always driving from different cities and towns and states, from New Jersey, California to Texas to Illinois. And we were driving back from California back to New Jersey. And we're in the middle of the desert and just dying of heat, no air conditioning. It was like 100,000 degrees in the shade. And we pulled to this gas station. We're just like dying. And this poor gas station attendant took one look at us and saw we were near death. And I was in particularly bad shape. So listen, my nephew left a bunch of comic books here. He was done with them. Would you like some? So he gave me some of these comics. And a lot of them were like, Archies and Caspers and that kind of thing, but also a lot of DCs and Batman and Superman, World's Finest. And it was my first exposure to comics. And I fell in love with them immediately. I read them and reread them over and over and over again as we finished our drive. And from that point on, I became a hardcore collector.
That's awesome. Now, did you ever keep any of those by any chance?
Well, I tried to. Unfortunately, what happened was I became a really good collector and trader for comics. I had a full Silver Age collection of Superman and Flash and World's Finest, and they were in pristine condition. And plus a lot of even some Golden Age stuff. It was in perfect condition.
Nice.
To trade other kids for them. And my grades dropped. My father, who was a monster, blamed it on comics, because back then comics were blamed for everything.
Yeah.
And brought me into the kitchen and tore them all up in front of me. I mean, a stack very, very high of comics that now would have been worth ridiculous amounts of money, and they were in pristine condition. I kept them that way, not to collect them, it's like to read them. So they would have been worth a lot of money today.
Brings it.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, really.
Oh, he was the most evil person I've ever known. Not even
Well,
exaggerating.
possibly good fuel for a storyteller such as yourself. Possibly.
Sure, believe whatever you like.
Well, so you've, you know, in your professional career, you've been a writer for so many different formats. You know, I believe you started playwriting and then, you know, moved into some animation and obviously television writing, movies, screenplays, all that stuff, which we'd love to get to everything. But of course, we are primarily a comic book podcast. And so I want to know a little bit about sort of breaking into comic book writing, particularly. You had, I think, started with some adaptations, but were really more known, I think, as a screenwriter until Rising Stars, which was the big sort of maxi series from Top Cow and Image. I'd love to know where that story came from. If it was something that you always had in your back pocket and were waiting for to do as a comic, and how did it end up where it ended up at Top Cow and being published in that way?
Yeah, I kind of got into comics more initially by happenstance. It had never occurred to me until a couple of editors said they never considered writing comics. And I did a Teen Titan Spotlight, and I did a Star Trek comic, and loved the experience a great deal. And oddly enough, it always been, I loved reading comics, and it just had never occurred to me to write them until that point. And all of a sudden, this could be an awful lot of fun. I mean, I know this area, I love to do it. We were finishing up Babylon 5, and I reached out to a number of different publishers about coming on board to write books for them, and no one got back to me. I couldn't figure out why. I sent a fax over to Top Cow, and I'm like, a month went by, and they said, they called the number, and they said, we figured this is a practical joke. We talked to other publishers as well. This is like a joke on their part that it wasn't really you. So they called thinking this has got to be a hoax of some kind. No, it's me. Really, it's honest. I met with Top Cow and talked them through what I want to do with Rising Stars. And where that comes from is the metaphor for the fact that we are all born with various talents and abilities, and we tend to very often squander them. We don't follow the natural inclination of our hearts. We don't push ourselves to make the best use of our time here. I think that we all tend to fall asleep in our lives to one degree or another until something happens to wake us up. A birth, a marriage, a prognosis, a diagnosis, and suddenly you're awake in your life for the first time. And in Rising Stars, what starts waking them up is the murder of some of them. They realize, that we are finite, we are limited, and we're here for a reason that we haven't been following up on. And they then use the second half of their lives to deal with that. So the idea of a maxi series that would follow these characters from birth till death over a 60-year period and show how they affected the world affected them, became something that was very personal to me.
Now, looking back over those 24 issues so long ago now, did the story turn out the way you had initially thought about it and developed it, or did it change in the telling over those 24 issues? In other words, was the 24 issues exactly basically what your outline was and where you wanted to take the series, or did things change as you were writing this kind of magnum opus and obviously having to deal with artists, because this was a different format than screenwriting, although you'd been working in animation, so maybe not. Where did it land in looking back on it?
I am a terrible outliner. I write the worst outlines in the history of terrible outlines. Because for me, I try and guess what the character might do in a given situation. I'm almost always wrong. If I'm writing the script, in the moment with the character, seeing what they choose to do, I'm almost always right. And so I try not to outline as much as possible. And so in this case, what I did was, imagine driving from LA to San Diego. You know where you're going to start, you know where you're going to end. You picked out a few places ahead of time where you for sure want to stop off on the way, but you leave yourself open for discovery. And where's that road go? And you follow it and you see what happens. So I ended up where I wanted to end up, and the parts that I wanted to hit on the way, I hit. But some other places and other storylines revealed themselves to me in the course of the writing process. So it was a very organic process.
Very interesting.
Great.
Now, one of the things that you worked on that has been a huge part of my life growing up as a kid certainly was Masters of the Universe. And I would love to know, how you got involved in that, and two, it was my understanding later on in life that the show is basically just the vehicle for the toys. So was there any guidance given to you as to how this or your portion of the story or what you were writing was going to be? Or did you just kind of create this stuff, just run with it, or how did that come about?
I had recently, I worked as a reporter for a number of years for San Diego magazines, and moved to Los Angeles, LA Times, LA Herald Examiner, Writer's Digest. And I ended up at People magazine, which I firebombed my career one day and walked out the door deliberately. And after that, was trying to figure out how to survive, because that was my only real source of income. And I knew guys who wrote animation, and they seemed to have a lot of fun with it. And I love cartoons. I grew up on cartoons. One of my first exposures to Superman outside of comics was in the Max Fleischer cartoons, which just were astonishing. And I said, well, maybe I should try writing animation. I like it. I enjoy the part. I like HeMan, the show. So maybe I should look into this. And I actually went around asking my friends if they had a sample script they could give me, and no one had any samples offhand. I think didn't want more competition for that world. I managed to find a copy of an old animation script in a bookstore, and used that format, and submitted a script cold. Did everything wrong, and no prior no agent, just sent the script in. And Arthur Nadell, who was producing the show at that time, called me in and said, listen, we are doing it like this already, so we can't buy this, but pitch me some stories. And I did, and he bought, I think, 3 or 4 of them that way, and then hired me on staff. And Arthur understood, the toy nature of the show, but he also didn't want to get in the way of the storytelling. So long as there's, characters used from the toy line that are in the show, so I don't care about the rest of it. Write what you want to write. And he rarely got into our face unless it was something that was too adult, or he used to write DB, do better, on scripts, and that's his big note. But he left me alone for the most part, which is what I asked from anybody. And it was a great experience. And I wrote a lot of scripts for HeMan, and moved on to Share, which is a different story. But it was a lot of fun, and I got to meet Larry DiTillio and other writers over there, and which I didn't have much of a chance to do otherwise. So it was good.
One thing I'm curious of is, since it's the time when HeMan was actually out and a big thing, there's certainly, as it pertains to fans and the fan world, it has gotten, it's probably bigger among fans now than it was then. And it appears that there is a huge backstory as it pertains to certain characters, and like King Randor and King Grayskull and this person and that person. Did that stuff ever exist back then, or has that just been a product of kind of fandom over the years, and out of necessity for various other incarnations of the show?
There actually was a fair amount of that written by Larry DiTillio, who wrote a number of episodes for the show and became a friend of mine. He was sort of the mythos and backstory guy. He had these huge long documents written about where Etheria and Eternia came from, and the political stuff and everyone's background. and he was like the master of this stuff. And I remember once we were at a toy store, and because we're both geeks, and all these kids were pulling their mothers toward the He-Man stuff and screaming and carrying on and crying, buy me, buy me, buy me. Larry said if they knew who we were and who we worked for, they would kill us. Larry was a very good writer, and again, in charge of the mythos. And we had this thing where we would declare war on each other randomly, depending on the different days. So one day, I declared war on him by stealing the platen from his typewriter. For those at home who don't know what a typewriter is, or don't, the platen is the long bar that the paper wraps around, so as you type it, it holds the paper in place. And I took the platen out and put the paper back in the roll again, like it was, so he wouldn't notice it. And he came back and was, I heard him walk into his office and sit down and go tap, 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 and stop. Gets up, comes to my office right across the hall. And I've covered my door with the cartoons, like Far Side cartoons and that kind of thing. It says, I want my platen back. I know not of this platen, sir. What do you speak of? He said, I want my platen back, or I'm going to burn your office down. And as he says this, he puts, his lighter to where the cartoons are. Like, right, are you going to give it back or not? And I said, go for it. And sure enough, he put the lighter to the cartoons, and there's flame going up the side of my door. And I wait to get about halfway through. I said, okay, reach in the platen and hand it back to him. He puts out the fire, goes back to his office, tap, tap, tap. As a moment later, Arthur Nadell, our producer, walks down the hall past my office, goes past, stops, backs up like in a cartoon, looks at the door, says, what happened here? Larry tried to burn my office down. Oh, I just kept on going. That was life of Filmation.
Just a normal part of work.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've talked to a couple of people over at who have worked with Filmation. I think it was Jeff Pervez he was one. Never mentioned any of that type of stuff going on.
Well, there was a lot of fun. There was, as you walk in the door, there was a big, huge bulletin board where they put up like a 5 foot by 5 foot poster of He-Man in different moods. Happy He-Man, sad He-Man, grief-stricken hit, and they were all exactly the same panel.
Yeah. Yeah, I can get into the animation part of it. That's a whole nother.
So I was going to swing back to comics, well, quite literally, as you'll get into these questions, but you had, after a few years with Top Cow, with your own imprint, Joe's Comics, moved over to Marvel. And I was wondering first if that was something that was initiated by Marvel coming to find you, or if that was something that you were looking for at Marvel, particularly maybe what eventually became your first assignment, which is SpiderMan.
It was more the former. What happened was they had just come through bankruptcy issues, and they were hemorrhaging money, and writers were fleeing because they were afraid of what was going on. And Joe Quesada and Bill Hemas wanted to sort of revive Spider-Man, because as Spider-Man goes, so goes Marvel. And also to use someone in a capacity that had some reputation to bring in the other writers back again. So they came to me and said, do you want to do Spidey? Actually, this happened at a convention. I think it was Chicago Comic-Con, I believe. And that was the same weekend that I played superhero. There was a guy who was, I was in a dealer's room, and I heard someone yell, "Stop him." I looked down the row, and there was a guy with a whole bunch of really expensive artwork making a run for it. He's sold all the stuff off someone's table. And as he comes racing toward me, followed by the guy who had the table, I tackled him, just brought him down like a gazelle, man. And the owner and I held him for the cops to show up. Funnily enough, after they took him away, the guy who ran the convention came up to me and said, "Why did you do that? You could have been hurt." I took him to where I was standing, under a 10-foot tall cutout of Superman. I said, how could I stand in front of that, in front of him, and do nothing? So it was like the next day, and I was just browsing the dealer's room most of my time. And Joe and Bill came up and said, we would love to have you take on Spider-Man. And I said, I only have one rule, which is don't touch my stuff. I write what I write and don't change nothing. And they agreed to that, and Axel Alonso agreed to that. And that's where it started.
You mean through that whole thing you didn't want to say, with great power comes great responsibility?
I was going to say that maybe the answer was, if I didn't stop him, he would have killed my Uncle Ben.
You know.
But there was the Spider-Man cutout where I was standing. It had
Fair enough. Fair enough.
You work with what you have.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I'm curious whether Spider-Man was in sort of a pantheon of characters for you, if that was something that you were like always wanted to write, or if this was kind of the opportunity that was in front of you and you said, yeah, this is a great opportunity to sort of redefine or put my stamp on Spider-Man.
For me, the two main superhero characters were always Superman and Spider-Man. Superman for what he said about truth and the importance of using your power for the right things. And he always kept the promises, never hurt someone who didn't hurt him first. In my family, that was not the way it was done. And he had a moral code that my family lacked. So for me, Superman was what I aspired to become someday. Spider-Man was kind of what I was then. I was a nerd, I was geeky, I got bullied all the time, beat up all the time. And the idea of having this other life as a hero was very attractive to me. So those were always my two big ones growing up. And I was just honored to be involved in it. Just the idea of writing Spider-Man, like, holy crap, and I didn't set out to put my stamp on it. I just wanted to say, because when someone hands you a franchise character, it's a show of trust, and they expect you not to break it. So I didn't want to do things that would, put my stamp on it, but would also destroy the character. My job is to ask questions that haven't been asked before. So for instance, to start off with, everyone knows how Peter Parker became Spider-Man, bit by a spider that was radioactive. And all I wanted to do was ask a question, which was, did the spider have this power to get to Peter because it was irradiated? Or was it already containing those powers and had to get to Peter before the radiation killed it? As the second implies intent. Mm-hmm. And once you bring intent into the question, then well, whose intent is being acted upon? Where does this go? And from that one single question that no one had ever asked before, eventually came to the Spider-Verse and everything else that grew out of that. And we've seen where the Spider-Verse has gone since then. So for me, it's always a question of just asking the questions that no one has asked before.
And I think you asked quite a few great questions, which resulted in, these very well-known and very well-respected storylines as part of your run. Capping off with One More Day, which was sort of an inflection point, I guess, if you want to use a little bit of a cliche, in where Spider-Man stories kind of went from there, at least in the definition of, the relationship of Peter and Mary Jane. When you were putting together that story, did you know it was going to sort of blow up? Did you know there's going to be a lot of controversy to it and a lot of feelings on the part of fans regarding, what would ultimately happen there?
That did not weigh on me as much as the fact that I had issues with the story. When the reason that came about was that Marvel felt rather strongly that having Peter being married made him feel too old. And they wanted to unmarry him by any and all means necessary. And my note back to them was, let's just change one thing. So one thing in Peter's history that will ribbon out to him not marrying MJ. Keep everything else there. But they had the notion that he makes a deal with Mephisto, and all of his history is wiped out in ways that that's an awful lot of power to give to someone. And when you unleash that kind of power, where do you go with that character in the future? And it seemed like overkill. And the last issue was primarily Joe's, not mine. And I actually, when I saw what was happening, and this is public record, it's about like speaking out of school. I said, I need to take my name off this because it's Joe's book and he should have the proper credit for writing it. It's one of those too late, it's been solicited already, so it has to go out with that on it. So I wasn't pleased with how that book came out. I thought that the approach was not the best, but I wrote, probably a couple hundred comics for Marvel. And you have 2 or 3 that you look back at and you go, well, that was a problem. But you have to bear in mind the other 200 or 300 were great experiences. So yeah, I kind of got a bad rap for that one, even though it wasn't really necessarily my choice. But these things happen. They happen. And look, Marvel is the custodian of Spider-Man. I was a hired hand doing a job and trying to execute their agenda, the corporate agenda, the best that I could. And you have to understand that when you work in that capacity, those who are hiring you ultimately have the power to choose where the character goes. So could have been done better, probably. But that being said, other than that, it was a great experience on Spider-Man and Axel and Joe and everyone else kept their word up until that point to let me do what I want to do and not get in my way. And they weren't even trying to necessarily get in my way on that issue. They were just trying to have the right input, So I respect and regard them. Things happen. Things happen. We all do what we do for the same reason. It seemed a good idea at the time.
It's a kind of a natural progression in comics, though. It's like things get really big, and then they contract, and then they get big again. They blow it out. So Peter Parker gets married, he gets everything. Oh, but then we're gonna go back to basics, and we're gonna make him the way he was before, so we can build up the stuff again. So I don't know. And now everyone's just waiting for Mephisto to come and snap things into the MCU and erase whole characters and what. Anyway, sorry, but I digress. I want to move on to Ghostbusters. Again, another one of my just childhood treasures. Huge fan of the movies. Super excited when the cartoon came out. And I wanted to know kind of a little bit about went into writing those episodes, because the tone of that show was, I thought it was for a Saturday morning cartoon show. It was a little bit darker than the other stuff that was out, and not like it was Tales from the Crypt dark, but in comparison to some of the other stuff that was on at the time, certainly a little bit darker. And it seemed like it was like some of the episodes were serialized. They did make, some of them were connected. They make reference to other episodes, and like the Sandman episodes, that Sandman came around again and stuff like that. Was there a goal to that when they were creating those episodes, like, or were they meant to just be standalone?
It was meant to be a consistent universe. So a thing that happens here can be referenced somewhere else. In the Grundle, they mentioned Mrs. Faversham. Mm-hmm. So it was all just meant to be, one consistent universe. And yeah, it was much darker than what was generally out there. At least the syndicated shows were. Some of the networks, not as much as syndicated. What had happened with that show was I had been working on a show called Jason and Real Warriors, which I'm sorry. And I was called into Jean Chalopin's office one day and he explained to me that the other 2 story editors who had been brought on to work on Ghostbusters didn't realize they were going to be editing the 13 network episodes and the 65 syndicated all at the same time, and ran screaming from the room. And so we need someone they'll write their own episode, we need someone to story edit 78 episodes all at one time, and be funny. And I wasn't known for my humor back then. I was known for being a very serious writer. And I agreed to do it and met with Joe Medchuck and as well with the show, and they said, look, we want this show to feel like the movie, where you're free to be dark, you're free to delve with the character stuff. I said, look, I'm a big fan of like Lovecraft and Laura Dunsany and Richard Matheson and Twilight Zone, and I'm going to go dark if you're okay with that. Not always, because you need to have the light and the dark. Otherwise, if everything is dark, nothing is dark. And they said, absolutely. And they let me go where I wanted to go, and to make a consistent universe, to write whatever I wanted. And the one time I ever kind of questioned it was I wrote an episode called Chicken He Clucked, about a guy who makes a deal with Satan to get rid of all the chickens in the world because he lived above a chicken restaurant, and the smell had driven him mad. And the phone rang, and it was Joe Medchuck calling to say, how you doing? Is everything okay at home? I said, yes, why are you asking? Well, we just read this script and we figure either something is really wrong at home or you're funny that we thought you were. So, but yeah, they left me alone. I do my best work when I'm just left alone.
Were you ever told to kind of, hey, tone it down? This is a little too scary?
Well, on the network side, they had their own, censors and broadcast standards and practices, and they often got in my face over one thing or another, down to bouncing an episode because they said it makes reference to the Necronomicon, which is a real occult book.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, it's not a real occult book. It's made up by H.P. Lovecraft. And they refused to acknowledge that. They said, no, this is really trying to sneak in a real occult book. And I ended up having to take it out and refer to it as the book that cannot be named. And it was ABC's kind of censorship and attitude toward controlling the show and changing it in ways I thought were incorrect. That led me to leave the show after a while. Then when the ratings dropped, they brought me back again to try and fix it.
Was that the Cthulhu episode? Because I remember that was my first introduction to Lovecraft, as I was like, what is that creature? And they kept bringing up that name. And I think my father happened to overhear it. And he's like, what are you watching? I'm like, oh, this is the Ghostbusters cartoon show. And he goes, wow, really? Okay. And then it was after the fact that he was kind of explaining what, more about what that was. But I remember hearing that name, Necronomicon and Cthulhu, and, all those elements. And I just thought, of course, now I look back at it and I think about it more. But I was like, this is a really well-written show. And you'll be happy to know my 7-year-old son really loves it too. So
that's great.
So I would love to know if was there any did you have I know you wanted they're all to kind of be part of the same universe and consistent with one another, but did you ever want to create one big overarching story for the whole kind of either season or run on it that would kind of build up to, let's say, a Gozer type event for the series?
No, and you have to understand too that back then there really weren't those kind of overarching stories for TV series, particularly
right.
Animation, also live action, until Babylon 5. There had never been a planned multi-year or big arc like that. There were occasional two-parters. Plus in cartoon syndication, they swap episodes around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to get a coherent story is almost impossible because it's going to be always shifting around. That thought of a larger overarching storyline didn't really come about until I was working on another show called Captain Power. And I began to think, hang on, maybe there's a way to go around the expectations of the audience of one-offs, which back then everything was a one-off. You ended the episode, you hit the reset button, the next one starts fresh all over again. And I played with it about in that show, but then took it further in Captain Power. But for Ghostbusters, that thought had not yet occurred.
Turning back to Marvel, you did a resurrection of Squadron Supreme called Supreme Power. Is that something you pitched, or is that something Marvel again sort of came to you with an idea to do?
I didn't pitch it to them because I didn't know what was available. Only they in-house know what titles are available that they want to bring back. And they said, we have this book, Squadron Supreme, would love to see you do your take on it. And I saw the potential of what that could be, and took it on. And honestly, it became one of my favorite books until I screwed it up. We went from Supreme Power to Squadron Supreme. And when it became a team book, somehow it lost some of the power behind it. It lost the emphasis on Mark Milton. And the book had been selling really well, but in certain parts of the country, they had to keep it behind the shelf because it had mature, adult themes and images. And Marvel and I agreed that if we took that stuff out, we'd have a much bigger market for the book, and we could pick it the team book. And after we did that, I realized I made a terminal error because I don't know how to write it anymore. If I lost, the more adult approach to the storytelling, I lost focus on Mark. And I kept saying to Marvel, you need to get someone else on this book ASAP because I'm flaming out. I've screwed myself up, and I apologize. And when we've all made a mistake. And no, you'll get through this. No, I'm not. I'm not going to get through this. I've lost the fingerprints. Please send me a life wrap. Have someone else take over the book. And they didn't want to do that. And actually, I respect that because they were trying to keep me involved. But eventually, then the book just kind of stopped and frittered out. And in retrospect, I never should have made that agree to that idea of changing the book. I think that had we just been doing Supreme Power the whole time, it would have a legendary run.
Yeah, I think the initial impetus behind it in turning it into less a team book and more I guess dramatic
It's a character study.
character study, yes, was really great. And was it also your choice to make it part of the Max, the mature label? Was that something you said, if I'm going to do Squadron Supreme or some version of it, I want to take it in this direction?
No, I think that was Axel Alonso who said we want to bring this out through the Max imprint, and this is a good opportunity for it. So I knew from day one that I was going to have the freedom to really push it.
Good. I also wanted to ask, again, while we're on the topic of Marvel, a little about Thor. And you had, almost a character-defining kind of run on Thor and relaunching it. And again, it was, what did you see in Thor that made you want to do the book? And then what did you see in the opportunity of the character in the world that you wanted to explore or change that had not been maybe explored or changed before?
I've always been a fan of Thor. A lot of other writers kind of considered him silly and the way he talked and dressed and the whole Asgardian part of it. But I love mythology. I wanted to really explore that more. And when they said we're at a Marvel retreat, and I believe it was either Joe or Dan Buckley who said that, we're going to bring back Thor. He's been gone for like 2 or 3 years, and looking for, a writer to take him on a monthly basis. And if I recall correctly, they went to Neil Gaiman first, who ran like hell. Then they went to Mark Millar, who jumped out the window and ran down the block rather than even say, I'm waving my hand over here, over here, over here. And finally, I give it to Straczynski, let him take care of it. And what's it? I know how to do this. I know how to make this not a heavy action book, but a really strong character book with a fair amount of action in it. And all I ask is that if you're bringing the character back, let me have him outside all the big events for a while. Let me get him to a place where his character is solid, where the universe is solid, and then you can do whatever you want. Just leave me alone and with this character. And so the first issues I wrote, they were like, there's not a lot of action here. It's trust me, this is going to work. And every issue that came out of Thor, which before had never been a big seller, was in the top 10 every month without fail. And people responded to the changes. And part of that was, in classical mythology, you have, the gods and mortals hanging out together. You could be walking across a field and come across Diana or Zeus. And I wanted to restore the human connection because, Thor next to Iron Man is not that much of a power gap in some respects. But Thor next to a mortal, living next to a mortal, it makes him more godlike, but also at the same time more relatable, And that's why I want to put Asgard in Oklahoma. And when I said that to Marvel, they were like, are you on crack? I said, really? I said, trust me, this is a visual, black, Asgard, black. And it's all right. And it worked out really well. And I was about little over halfway through, almost 2/3 of the way through the plan that I had for Thor. I would end him up in a good place and then send him off into the world. And all of a sudden, these other writers who didn't want anything to do with Thor when they wanted to do the reboot, suddenly wanted in because it was a top 10 book suddenly. And they wanted to do the Siege of Asgard. I said, please, not yet. Just give me a little more time. Let me finish what I started, then you can do it. But they wanted it right now. And I called Dan Buckley and I said, look, it's your character. You own him. I respect it. I honor that. But if this is going to be happening, I can't be involved with the Thor book anymore. And he understood that. And that was, I think, kind of like the last part of my work for Marvel. So yeah, it was unfortunate because I think had I been allowed to finish up, what I was doing, it would have been a spectacular book.
What did you envision happening as it pertains to your work on it?
Really cool stuff. I don't want to blow it out and talk about it. Someday, who knows, I may have a chance to come back and do it again.
Okay, fair enough.
But it would, and look, I have nothing but the most substantial regard for all the editors at Marvel. It's a great place to work. It's always when the corporate side kind of gets into the process, and that's when on any basis, whether you're making television, movies, comics, whatever it is, when the corporate side takes precedence over the creative side to a certain extent, things happen. But I'm working again for Marvel now. I'm doing some stuff for them, and I feel like I've come home in many respects. It's a great company to work for. I'm having some fun stories that I'm working on. So things happen, but it was great. It is a great relationship.
So to that point, is that what drew you to DC?
Well, there aren't a lot of shops in town. So I sort of said to Marvel, I'm taking a bit of a hiatus. I went over to DC and Dan DiDio, we had a conversation at a convention, and I said, I would love to do Superman. And we agreed to do Superman Earth 1, which was maybe one of the most personally satisfying things I've ever done was those graphic novels. I also started doing Superman Grounded. The problem I ran into, there's a thing called Fuchs corneal dystrophy, which is where the part of the 2-cell thick layer of the eye that wicks away moisture stops working. And if you've ever seen a pool that hasn't been cleaned, how the surface gets very covered with leaves and stuff, that's what was happening to my eyes. And I was losing that, plus early onset cataracts. I was losing my sight. I was writing with my screen with letters about this high to be able to see the words at all. And it was interfering with my ability to finish books on time, and led to my taking a hiatus from comics after I started Superman Grounded on a monthly basis. To Dan, I can't do this on a monthly basis anymore. I have to let go of Wonder Woman for the same reason. And had kind of reconciled myself to, and took a hiatus, that my career might be in serious trouble. But because the process for the corneal transplant at that time was not good. The results were often worse than the problem. And a new technique had been discovered for transplanting. We're only the two cell thick layer, not the whole cornea. And I went for the procedure in Portland. Dr. Mark Terry, an amazing doctor who created this technique, and came out the other side of that process with 20/20 vision. And I can see, I don't need glasses anymore, and the endothelial layer is working fine. So eventually I came back from comics to do comics after that and all fixed. But that was why I had to leave monthly comics, was that I could not keep up with the work anymore. But now I'm in 20/20.
You're talking to two guys wearing glasses right now, too.
Yes.
Like, that sounds really beneficial, that 2020.
So jealous.
I wanted to dig into Earth One, Superman Earth One specifically, which was, a big swing at the time, and which I think connected certainly. What made you want to do a re-envisioning of Superman versus taking over Superman in continuity in the same way you might have done it, or you had done at Marvel with Spider-Man?
Well, I did have that option with Grounded of picking him up in continuity, and did that for the book. But in terms of Earth One, they were launching a series of these Earth One titles that would basically be reimaginings of the characters. So I was folding into what they were already planning to do, and began the process of, if I was to invent Superman now, what would it look like, and how would it play out, and how would he develop as a character? And just really, really proud, and the artwork is just phenomenally beautiful, and it's a chance to kind of go inside of a character in a way that we really hadn't seen before in a whole lot. And that's what I like the best of, is playing with the characters. So went back to Spider-Man for a second. For decades, they always treated me like this frail woman who ever found out the secret that Peter Parker was Spider-Man would kill her. And I said, I never bought that for a second, that this is a woman who raised a kid on her own. His parents died, her husband died. She raised them well. And to do that, you need a spine of solid titanium. I always used to say that he got his powers from the spider, but his strength from Aunt May. And to explore that relationship in Clark Kent's world, where did he get his strength from? To see that with the relationship with his parents who were still alive, and branching out on his own and having to make certain kind of decisions, how he was going to spend his life, and having that be a ricochet of how he was raised, was too great an opportunity to pass. It's very often not about the big fights with me. It's who is the character, because that's the gateway to the story. Big action scenes are great, but ultimately comes down to your character. I worked for a while with Jim Cameron, a couple of projects. And he said the smartest thing I've ever heard said about writing science fiction. And so I used to think it was all about familiar characters and unfamiliar settings. It took me 10 years, he said, to realize I was wrong. The similar relationships in unfamiliar settings. So Terminator 2 is a father-son story, even though it's not. Aliens is a mother-daughter story, even though it's not. It's always down to the relationships and the characters. That's why I tend to, as much as I'm known for doing big action stuff, ultimately I'm a character guy.
Now, Superman, it's seemingly every, decade, a couple decades, will go through a period where he is redefined in some way, shape, or form. And there was probably Man of Steel, by John Byrne. There was Mark Waid's Superman Birthright. When you were approaching Earth One, did you think about those at all, and how to distinguish your reimagining of Superman? Or did you kind of throw all of that to the side and say, this is just sort of my pure vision of how I would do Superman from the blocks up.
I think it has to come down to what you want to do with the book or the story. The moment you begin comparing what you're doing against somebody else, in a way, you are letting that other project define what you're doing, almost like a reverse. He did this over here, so I'm going to do the opposite of that over here. What's a negative image of that, you know? And you just have to start with the character. You don't think about what came before. Everything's been done by somebody, but fortunately no one was paying attention, so I had to start over again. Who is the character? What do they want? How far would they go to get there? And how hard was someone else go to stop them? You answer those 4 questions and you have your story. It's not about what somebody else did down the road. It's all about who the character is.
As you could see, I'm a big Superman fan, so I thoroughly
Your house
enjoy.
is like my house, by the way.
Does
We have a lot of the same action figures, and
there's way more stuff over
ditto.
there.
I
house
collect
like-
windows.
That's
My
my
house
wife.
looks like it was decorated by a 14-year-old with a Platinum American Express card, which is pretty much what happened.
There you go. Sweet. So I really enjoyed Earth One Superman. And I mean, I would venture to say that they took elements of that and having incorporated it into what is now Superman in the New 52, or I guess it's no longer New 52, or whatever the current incarnation of Superman is labeled. But it's just such a great series of stories. And I know that they had planned like other characters too to do that same treatment. So they had Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman, Green Lantern, and I believe they had planned on doing Aquaman, but I guess that was canceled. I did read that you had plans to do a Flash version as well. Is that true?
I did, and it ran into the rocks of my visual issues that I was having. And Dan said, "Don't worry, we'll hold on to it until you're ready." And by the time I kind of circled back again, they were always sort of phasing out most of the Earth One stuff. So that sort of took care of that.
What would you, or I guess more importantly, what would you like to do to Superman, or that hasn't really been done, or what do you think, what do you think you could do to Superman at this point to make him more compelling? Because, and as much as I love Superman, I find myself criticizing the character so frequently because, he is a godlike, character. And, it's so very hard to challenge a character like that. And the only time that I think you're really able to do so is you find someone as powerful as he is, or you hit him where it hurts, like with with this family. And that they've done that, in one point or another, or all at once right now. What would you do to with Superman nowadays?
I don't want to get into specifics because you want to put out your work in that way. But for me, you're right. There is a power issue. Who do you put him up against? And he can't be hurt. But I've always maintained that his skin cannot be pierced, but his heart can.
Mm-hmm.
And not just about his family, but about the world and people in general. The Superman that I grew up with was the most decent guy on the block. And some make fun of the big blue Boy Scout thing. Mm-hmm. But there's a place in the world for kindness of spirit. There's a place for, gentleness. Where when he's Superman is when he doesn't push it to the maximum. When he does. He's not. I'm looking at down the hallway. I have a whole row of Superman pictures all lined up. There's an honor about him, and I think that a lot of people are afraid to write that because it sounds cliche or it can become sappy. When I took on Thor, again, I made him a person of honor, and when a person got those promises, and there are ways of doing that won't be sappy, that won't be trite. And I would like to explore, that Superman. And that's also kind of why I had him walking across the country, was to put him in a situation were not about taking on a big bad guy. He started out originally going up against corporations and landlords who were exploiting people. That's how he began, as being there for the everyday person. There was an issue of Grounded that I wrote before I had to leave, which is very autobiographical. There was a kid, it's a sort of a kid whose father was abusive, and the kid's a Superman fan and is waiting for Superman to come along and save him from his dad. And a lot of it's based on me at that age. And I remember seeing the cover design when it came in, that there's this like 10-year-old kid in a Superman t-shirt with a black eye. And it was like 10-year-old me looking out of a Superman comic book at grown-up me looking at a 10-year-old me. And that book resonated with a lot of people. There's also a sequence where he talks a woman down who's going to commit suicide. She's on a ledge, and he doesn't grab her, doesn't force her to come down. He just listens to her and offers his emotional support in ways that save her. And that sequence is all over the online world. You can call it up almost anywhere. And I heard from so many people afterward who said that they gave us their friends who were, suicidal or thinking about it, and it made a difference. Those are the kinds of stories that aren't contingent on him beating up somebody big. It's in a way, it's the smaller you go, the more personal it becomes.
I will say, as a current comic book collector reader, stories like that I find very gratifying, because we're I've said this ad nauseum, but like, we are bombarded as comic book readers with events, large events that span a year, and they happen so frequently that we're numb to them. You can only have a crisis after another crisis so many times where it doesn't matter. So to have small contained stories that are really good is very gratifying. So, that's what I really enjoyed about, that the Grounded series, because, it kind of, I think it goes back to what you said earlier about, as it pertains to Superman and Peter Parker. Superman's the person that you want to be or strive to be, but Peter Parker is really kind of the person that you are, at least at that moment, So it's gave myself goosebumps when you said that. Jesus.
The same thing happened when I worked on Brave and the Bold for DC. I said I want to wrap those books not around big events or cosmic events, but around essential moral questions and ethical character questions. There's an issue where the Flash accidentally goes back in time to the World War II era, breaks his leg and he can't get back. And he's in the middle of a battle against the German army, and the Blackhawks are there. And they're fighting it out with the Germans, and Flash like throws all these bricks at them and knocks them all out. And Blackhawk grabs him by the front of his outfit and said, "What the hell is wrong with you? You don't just knock out the enemy, because what's going to happen is they're going to wake up in half an hour, pick up their guns, they begin shooting at us. You are an American in a battle zone. We are at war with the Germans. You shoot and you kill them before they shoot and kill you." And Barry Allen's like, "Well, the Flash doesn't do that." "Well, you better figure it out, because if you don't do it, I'll put a bullet in your brain myself." And where it comes down to, finally, he finds a truck with uniforms and such, and the Flash cannot kill, but Barry Allen, in the uniform of his country, in the middle of World War II, can. When is it correct to kill? Is it ever correct to kill? And those are the kinds of questions that those books explored. And it's not about the big event. It's about, the quiet turning of your considered conscience. It's about the human heart in conflict with itself. Those are the stories that I love to tell, that I think have the most value.
That's so cool listening to talk about that. Sorry.
I wonder if this is a left turn, given what we've just been talking about, or if it is an exemplar of what you've been talking about in terms of the sort of moral, explorations. But that is your work on Before Watchmen, which is it's based on one of the most celebrated graphic novels of all time, and so it's pre-existing. I hate to use this word, but IP or property. But did you find were you intimidated to take on these characters, or did you look at it like you have other assignments, which I think I know what the answer is, which is that you can find these new character explorations despite sort of maybe the heavy expectations of, taking on something that has not been explored since the first graphic novel or for the first series came out?
Well, certainly, number one, I have a great deal of respect for Alan Moore. I think that whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow is still one of the best Superman stories ever written, without even hesitation. And to create Watchmen, he went to the Charlton characters and essentially updated them to make those characters. He didn't hesitate to do that. And the property belonged to DC, and they said we came to Alan many times, offered him whatever money he wanted to pick up the story. He chose not to, and we want to take a shot at this. And it was, for me, I'm reverential about Watchmen. I reread that book on an almost yearly basis, just to savor the language and the structure and the counterpoint of the dialogue versus the image, and how one comments on the other without actually coming out and saying it. It's like a storytelling tesseract. You can turn it every different way. It looks differently from every different angle. So again, I wanted to explore, the characters and where they were going, and with Dr. Manhattan, do a story that's operated on an almost quantum level, structurally. So I was definitely daunted at the responsibility of doing this right. And particularly in the Dr. Manhattan book, I worked as much as I could to replicate Alan's tone wherever I possibly could, to be respectful. But it was an awful lot. It created a lot of dust in the air at the time, but it was fun to work
on. I have to ask, because you have just an amazing career. You've done so much. You've worked on TV, movies, comics. Is there one particular area you enjoy writing for more than the other? And not to discredit anything else or anything like that, but maybe it's just you get into the swing of things, of just banging out the story, or maybe the creative process is a bit different, a little bit more rewarding. Is there any one of those that you just enjoy more?
No, I doesn't matter what the format is, doesn't matter if it's comics, movies, TV, fiction, whatever else. I enjoy the storytelling process. I enjoy asking the next logical question to see where it takes me. There are different rewards when you see you turn in a script for a comic, and in comes phenomenal artwork that just blows you out of your chair. Mm-hmm. You write a scene for a movie or TV show, and the actor comes in and then is able to knock that scene out of the park. They are all equally cool to me. One thing that I can't do well is poetry. I suck at poetry. I've tried so many times, and it's just people like sit me down and hand me some water and say, "Don't ever do that again." But no, as long as I have the freedom to write what I want to write, I like all of it equally.
I have an extra question here for you, and this is, Mike, if you want me to cut this later on, by all means. It's not controversial, it's just a little silly. I read that you were involved in the creation, or you worked on Godzilla versus Kong.
Yeah.
But you weren't credited on it. is that true for one? And two, were you happy with the final product?
What happened with Godzilla versus Kong is that they convened a writer's room. It
Okay.
was me and about, I want to say 10 other writers, all spitballing what the movie could be and should be. And then out of this conversation came the rough parameters of a story that was then assigned to one particular writer to then execute the script. So no, I didn't get credit, but neither did anyone else in that room. And we were all paid for our consultation fees. So I was perfectly fine not to get credit on it. I thought the movie was serviceable. I think it could have gone in more interesting directions than it did. It seemed like they sort of went for the easy choices, but I wasn't the writer charged with it, putting that in the script form, so it's not my place to say beyond that.
No, just curious. Godzilla is just one of those, again, one of these, you've worked on so many things that are just so near and dear to me. And I have to say, it's just an honor to talk to you about it because, like I said, Ghostbusters, Superman, HeMan, Godzilla, it was one of these things I remember as a child sitting next to my dad on the living room floor watching it on TV. And it was one of the early movies I saw in a theater with my father, Godzilla in 1984. So, and it's anytime one comes out, I'm there to watch it. So to be able to talk to someone who's involved in it, awesome.
I'm also a huge Godzilla fan. Actually, Godzilla and I are almost exactly the same age, which may explain a great deal about both of us.
You have the same jawline. I just,
I think so. You haven't seen the back either. But I remember seeing the movie when I was a kid and just being terrified by it. The first time he pops his head over the hill was just amazing. And the long walk over Tokyo. Sometimes when I get bored, I watch people make a Godzilla hand puppet that I can use, hand shadow on the wall. I actually have a 5 foot tall Godzilla sculpted head sitting in my garage.
Wow.
And at some point, there's in the foyer of my house, there's like 2 pillars that come up, then a flat area on top. At some point, when I have the strength to try this without dropping the goddamn thing, I plan to put it up on this high pillar in my foyer. So when you walk in the door, it's the first thing you see is Godzilla from on high looking at you.
Can it
so
make
yeah,
the
I'm a
sound?
huge Godzilla fan.
And that was why I liked 1984 so much, is that it was the first Godzilla movie in a long time that, first of all, it was, I guess, technically a direct continuation of the original Godzilla movie. At least they brought in Raymond Burr again for like the US version of it. And it was scary. He wasn't like goofy. He didn't have a son or any of those elements that were brought up in like the previous versions. Like Godzilla was genuinely scary again. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. So
Well, it's scary in the first one, but also more to that point, for those folks who do not know necessarily, on the original 1954 movie, when they brought Raymond Burr to Americanize it and in some ways cripple it, I think. The original Japanese version, Gojira, is available to purchase or stream, and I highly commend that version to you. It is an infinitely better film. Godzilla is much more scary in that film. It's magnificently written. The acting is amazing. It's just, and then when you look back and you have to see Gojira and you go see Godzilla with Raymond Burr, you see all parts he took out to make room for him standing in a room with a pipe narrating something. You realize we kind of ruined that movie to a certain extent. It did really well for Japan as far as the American market was concerned. They hadn't really cracked it before. But it's such an amazingly well done film in its original form.
Absolutely.
It's two totally different experiences. I remember seeing Gojira probably only a few years ago, having grown up like most Americans with the Raymond Burr version, and yeah, it's like watching a totally different film. And,
I was talking to a guy who was involved with the production of the original film, and why Godzilla became such a icon for the Japanese people. And he told me something that I had never heard before, which was that in the movie, back up, during the war, there have been strict censorship rules against criticizing the government. You were not allowed to say or publish anything that was critical of the war effort or the war ministry. And in the course of the movie, there's a part where Godzilla steps on and destroys the Ministry of War building. Just not identified by name, but if you note the silhouette, you know what it is. Mm-hmm. And he said, I was there when they screened the movie for the first time. And he said, when Godzilla walks on and destroys the Ministry of War, people applauded. People were in tears. That the anger and the repressed frustration that they had of not being able to express their unhappiness with the war have been acted upon. He was afraid they were going to start yelling and carrying on and try and ban the film. But said, and that's the moment when Godzilla became a hero of the people. Like, wow.
That's amazing. Oh, well, Joe, you've been very generous with your time. I'm going to take one opportunity to take sort of my bonus question. It's not as silly or probably or interesting as the Godzilla stuff. And then we'll wrap up. But I would love to know, we didn't talk a whole lot about art, and this is sort of the collaborative medium that is comics and working, writers with artists and coming up with storytelling. And I wonder, from your perspective, what makes a writer-artist collaboration work? And I'm thinking particularly just by looking at, your work and my own proclivities that, Gary Frank is an artist that you worked with early on it was Midnight Nation. Yep. Which was a phenomenal series, by the way. And then you came back with Supreme Power. So you can use him as an example, or anybody else, or just talk generally. But what makes in your mind a collaboration work between a writer and an artist on a particular comic?
Well, for me, on the one hand, you want the action to look good. You want the narrative flow of the storytelling across the page. I have a certain rhythm to what I write, and the way that the panels are written out and the way they cascade down, there's a rhythm to the structure of it that the artist kind of has to dig into. But ultimately, whether it's comics or TV or movies, but I get to our conversation now, particularly comics, is my work lives or dies by this angle, on the character's face. If you can see emotion in the character's face to go with the dialogue, I'm golden. And Gary is just fucking supernatural, man. He is just so gifted. And actually, Gary's doing covers for the secret project I'm working on now for Marvel. I just seen the first one. It's just, oh my God. And or it's JRJR or Chris Weston or others that I've worked with. The ones that I always come back to again and again are those that are expressive emotionally and not afraid to be emotional in the storytelling. And once you have that, when the narrative flow from panel to panel is worked out, then the action is fluid and feels almost like you're watching a movie. That's the best combination. I would crawl naked and bleeding for Broken Glass and Monkey Vomit to work with any of those guys again. They're just so talented, and Gary in particular is just like one of my all-time faves.
Mine as well. I remember seeing his work first on Peter David's Hulk run, and taking over those big shoes to fill of Dale Keown, and just knocking it out of the park, and then just getting better and better and better with every project.
He's scary.
He's certainly top of his game.
Yeah.
Well,
all right.
Yeah, I don't, how do we put a bow on this that is just so perfect? Mr. Joe Michael Straczynski, it's just an absolute pleasure that that you could join us. It's an honor. Thank you so much for all of your contributions to, TV, film, comics, our childhood, Godzilla, it goes on and on. I know you mentioned
I
that
I get to have fun. I'm very lucky. I get to do what I love for a living, and what's better than that?
Yeah, it's not working when you do that. It's
Yeah.
really not. I know you mentioned that you're working on something that you can't discuss for Marvel, but is there anything coming up that we can look forward to that you can discuss?
Just today, AWA announced my new book that I'm doing for them called The Madness,
Okay.
which comes out, I believe, in the summer. I have a new novel that will be coming out in the spring of next year called The Glass Box. In theory, I have a film going into production, starting prep in Europe in June. And I'm still waiting for some kind of word about Babylon 5 on the pickup on that. So there are many things in the works. Also, I just finished doing a 2 big audio dramas for Penguin Random House. One is an ongoing series, one is anthology series, one is a contained story. They want to move more from not just doing audiobooks, but audio dramas. So they're kind of looking to spearhead that with my stuff. And there is something I'll be debuting at Comic-Con that is Babylon 5 related, but I can't talk about what it is yet.
And welcome back. So I hope you guys really enjoyed that. It's so cool talking to him. Like you said, comic book heavy hitter, a legend in his own time. I mean, he's a man who's kind of covered all these different genre and comic books and film and TV and all this great stuff. And he had the time to talk to us. I mean, who would have thought? I'll be honest, I was hoping at some point to see a Flash Earth 1 series, but I guess the way things are going, it may not come to fruition. But at any rate, if you haven't already done so, definitely check out Superman Earth 1, Batman Earth 1, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern. Even I think they have Titans Earth 1. All great series.
Yeah, I love talking to Joe, if I can call him Joe. And it was interesting that we had Joe Michael Straczynski and we had Joe Marcel and Mike Farah. Oh, synergy, guys.
Whoa.
Come
You see
on.
it?
Crazy
See it?
name stuff.
Crazy.
No, it was a pleasure talking to him. And, we could have gone on forever, as we can do with a lot of guests, but particularly him. I just love learning about the process. I'm a process guy of coming up with these stories and figuring out how to unpack the characters and serve the characters during these big momentous story arcs that he puts together. And if he can't get enough of JMS, he's got a new ongoing series, Captain America, coming out soon. So definitely look that up. Highly anticipated from the Dollar Bin Bandits as well. And we hope that you guys enjoyed the interview. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing us. Thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing. And we will see you next time. Peace.